This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning and welcome to the Empress of Biz. We are delighted to be here and we have gone to the new technology, at least to the Empress, it's new. We are doing video thanks to my co-host Sal Acosta. Good morning, Sal. How are you this day?
Good morning, JoAnn. Very good, and thank you for being here on the show with us, and thank you for Dolph. And you're right, we've moved from pure audio to audio and video, and hopefully that makes it a little bit more interesting to everybody that's not only listening but watching.
Yes, that means I have to put makeup on early in the morning, guys. One of the great things about I've discovered knowing Sal is, besides his great business accomplishments, is all the people he knows. And that's part of being in business. In fact, the three of us were talking about old-fashioned thing like the Rolodex and how we still can work that. I use it. You probably are more advanced than me, gentlemen, but I'm still using the Rolodex, and every once in a while we use a smartphone. Our guest, Dolph Santorine, sorry.
I've been called worse, JoAnn.
Well, but not by me, so that's good. Intrigued me because you have a fascinating background. You have gone from manufacturing to high tech to you are now semi-retired, but it sounds like you're really busy being semi-retired. And Sal suggested that we talk to you because of the wide scope of things you've done. So good morning and welcome to the Empress of Biz and co-hosted with my good friend Sal Acosta.
Well, JoAnn, thank you. It's been a great ride. And the simple version is I spent my first 15 years in business in the manufacturing business and my second 15 in the technology business. But, I guess the way I look at it, I've almost always been in the people business and the leadership business. And I think that, I think that's the common thread between the two. But I think it's also a fascination with the way things get done. I've always been a habitual early adopter, so making the transition from the manufacturing business to the technology business for me wasn't really that big a deal. And when I was in college, I spent my $1,000 on a computer instead of, much to my dad's chagrin, on a computer instead of on a vehicle, which I probably should have done. But the knowledge I gained from the computer has ended up serving me, I think, a whole lot better than a 10-year-old car would have at the time.
Definitely.
Let me ask you a quick question there because I know you have a very technical background and you like, technical work and engineering and operations. And I did too. And that's why when you were growing up and maybe becoming an engineer, did you consider yourself like introverted because of that analytical nature? And did you have to teach yourself to be extroverted, to deal with people, to communicate, to have leadership skills? Or was that natural for you anyway, even though you have this sort of technological, analytical bent?
I think that it's kind of interesting because, when a lot of other folks would go out and play golf, I was the guy who, wanted to go in the shop and fire up the lathe. So I think there was a little bit of a difference than that. I think I have a lot of that to credit with my dad, who desperately wanted me to go to West Point. And unfortunately, that was not in the cards. But I probably, in retrospect, I probably would have enjoyed it. Captain of my high school wrestling team, captain of the football team. So I guess I was a little bit of an extrovert and I was kind of pushed into that by my dad. So I think that served me well. I also ended up, I was involved with my college fraternity, and they're really little leadership pressure cookers. That's because that's what they are. When you're a 19-year-old kid and they end up handing you a fairly significant budget, and then it's like, okay, now go run it. You grow up really fast, especially when you've got 50 plus guys who are depending on you for the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. My son ended up being the house manager for his fraternity, and good training. That's all I can say.
Oh yeah, I mean, budget. You've got all the personnel problems that you'd have in spades, and you either learn to manage out of it, or you get an education quickly. Either way, it's a win.
Let me ask you a quick question, just for maybe, hopefully we have some listeners that are even below college age, and fraternities every once in a while come out on the news, and like everything that comes out on the news, right? It's not for good reasons. But having said that, maybe as a context and a bias, somebody that is thinking of going to college over the next couple of years, would you recommend they join a fraternity for all the things that we have just talked about, and or have things changed from your time to now?
I think things have changed, but I think they've changed for the better. I mean, my fraternity, Phi Delta Theta, is really, it's a leadership institute. I mean, that's part of their mission statement, is to be the premier leadership development fraternity on campus, period. And that's what they do. And it includes, they do stuff for the president, but from not beyond the president, every summer they end up having an emerging leaders institute at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and they bring 1,000 young men in from all over the country, and they subject them to some of the best leadership training. It's just absolutely amazing.
I'd love to see women in that too, to be honest.
Well, the sororities end up doing that as well. And you know what? A lot of this we ended up copying from the sororities because they were first and they did a better job with it.
Oh, so, you're smooth.
No, JoAnn, and anyone who ends up being, straightforward with you, who's in the fraternity world, will end up telling you that the sororities were very much on the cutting edge, and they do a better job with philanthropy, and they do a whole lot better job keeping their alum involved than we do on the fraternity side.
Right, that's good. You came, when we discussed yesterday, your transition from manufacturing to technology. Would you tell more about what happened in the technology and your business, so people really get an idea of all the things you've done?
Yeah, and yes, and I was thinking a little bit more about that this morning, and from a capital standpoint. But in the 90s, I ended up, with a couple of very talented engineers, ended up developing a really neat improvement on the product we were making at the time. And the problem I had was I had to bet my bottom dollar on this product. So we got it tooled, we put it in production, it started going extremely well. And obviously I had to end up paying for all that development. It was money that I ended up borrowing. I had, I was pretty much extended at the end, but I knew that going in. What I didn't expect was the Chinese copy machine to come into play. And, months after introducing the product very successfully, I get a phone call from a distributor who was bringing stuff in from Asia, primarily China. And they had a copy of my flagship product. And so I ordered a couple, had a friend order a couple, and they came in, and of course we took them apart. And it was remarkably good, which is unfortunate. But when I had the tooling made, I ended up putting my kids' names at kind of a little hidden spot in the tooling that nobody would know is there except for me, because, in a lot of ways they ended up suffering through, me birthing this product. The Chinese copied that as well.
Wow.
So it engendered a call to, that drove me to call my attorney, because we had spent all this money on patents. And his response was, well, we can fight a patent action. I need $50,000 to get started. And of course, that was an impossible number at the time, for our $700,000 a year manufacturing company. So, what we ended up doing was selling the company.
And then can you tell us what the product is, or is that?
No, yeah, that's fairly technical. It's a high frequency loudspeaker, very specialized high frequency loudspeaker that you would see in a concert sound reinforcement setting.
Okay. Hey, Dolph, let me ask you a question. question, just to maybe understand the context a little bit more. So you sell your company, I'm assuming, to a bigger outfit. I'm assuming they're also aware of this Chinese competition, knockoff, plagiarism, whatever you want to call it. Um, and I'm also assuming they think that in spite of that they can compete. So is it because they had bigger pockets to maybe enforce the patent rights, or they didn't care, or what was happening there in that aspect of the transaction?
I made a component. They made the whole product. So basically, what they were in a situation was I was competing with another component. Because they ended up making the whole thing, they could have forced it in and then they maintained control. Especially in the 1990s, the quality control of product coming out of China was awful. And so you had no idea what was going on. Then their competitors ended up eventually figuring that out anyway. I didn't have to, but I didn't have the resources to weather that storm.
And that is an issue that we unfortunately still deal with today, and it's a challenge. I'm not going to get into politics, but I've been in business forever, and so the family. The one part of the business going back to 1906, so we've been around for a while.
Wow.
And you get these challenges, and we have to deal with them one way or another. And some of it's through legislation, some of it's not, some of it's through being smarter. But as I was telling you, gentlemen, I said I don't mind having the playing field tilted. I just don't want it at a 180-degree angle.
And I agree. And I think that, while I don't agree with a lot of the machinations, especially with the tariffs that are going on right now, I'm thankful that Trump is doing something to try to hold these folks accountable. Because not only are they basically stealing our intellectual property, which is what they did to me, but it's almost impossible to fight it, especially if the multinationals can barely fight it because they have extremely limited access to any court system in China. So, and besides that, fortunately, we're at a situation now where we've got a little bit of tax relief. But I guess the real question is, are we going to end up getting, especially from smaller manufacturers, are we going to end up getting any relief from the thinking that the Asians are invincible? Because they're not. The way they've been invincible is they have a lower cost of capital if they have to borrow it, and they have a lower cost of capital if they end up needing to go to their capital markets, because the stock exchanges over there don't expect the stratospheric returns that we need to have here in the United States to end up being be considered successful.
So,
oh, by the way, let me just comment on that, because again, we're all sort of in a related age group, but for people that don't have the historical context, I remember at one point in my professional career where the Japanese were going to take over the world. Right. Everything was made in Japan. Companies like Xerox were struggling. Companies like Kodak were struggling with the Japanese filmmakers. And the Japanese were just showing up with, suitcases full of cash to buy properties in California. Of course, we didn't have PayPal back then. And not that they have gone away in any way, because they're still making fantastic products and electronics and cars and so on and so forth. But I think it's fair to say that people today are not worried that the Japanese are going to take over the world. I think something similar is going to happen to China, with the difference that obviously China is a much bigger country than Japan. The population is much bigger. So for that sort of steady state to come about, is going to take a lot longer, but I think eventually there will be a steady state, kind of what happened with Japan. And by the way, Taiwan too. At one point everything was made in Taiwan, right? Electronics, bicycles, this, that, and the other thing. And again, it's not like Taiwan has gone away or disappeared, but we've reached a steady state. Let me ask you this, Dolph. Without getting into politics, if you had a magic wand, what do you think would be the best way to address these competitive issues with China, and even other countries in the future, by the way.
Yeah, the labor rate is going to be what the labor rate's going to be. I think that, right now, there's a couple of hurdles. And I think the first hurdle is from a patent standpoint. Now, well, so I've got to apply for a patent in the United States. I've got to do another one for Europe. There's really no compact. There's really no complete agreement on how this works. And that, I think, is problematic. We've gotten a lot of relief with the corporate tax rates being right sized. I mean, we used to be, depending on who you talk to, 10 to 15% higher than the rest of the world, especially the Japanese. And I think that those are the two key things. But, there needs to be rule of law, not we'll steal your stuff and beat you with it, which is pretty much what the Chinese end up doing. But, Sal, it's been interesting because when we were young kids, the Japanese stuff was junk, and then the Japanese stuff got really good, and then the Taiwanese stuff was junk, and then the Taiwanese stuff got really good, and then the Korean stuff was junk, and then the Korean stuff got really good, and now we've moved to China, and the question is, what's next? Vietnam has ended up abandoning their communist economy, and so all of a sudden, they could be a player. Thailand is starting to be a player. It's going to be a question of where does it go. I understand now with, China is making a huge play for cheap labor in Africa because it's going to have to go someplace. Those kids in China are coming in from the fields and the rice paddies, end up working in the factories in the city where they can make a multiple of what they made before. And it's the same program, and it's played over and over again. It played in Japan, and then it played in Taiwan. I mean, I don't need to go through the whole thing, but so I think equal protections with other countries for intellectual property, which I think is key. And then as long as we don't get stupid with our tax rates, I think we're going to be okay. If we're 10% higher than somebody else on corporate tax rates, we're in trouble.
Well, we're talking about this, but this is interesting because a lot of times when people go into business, they don't think of these things. All they're thinking is, here's the cup. I'm going to sell it. Maybe I'm making the cup. Maybe I'm serving it in a restaurant. Maybe I'm designing it and I'm helping to sell the design or whatever it is. But they don't think about the things that we're talking about right now, how external circumstances force you to do some different things. And all of a sudden you have to wake up. Like when I became president of the Greater Pittsburgh chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners, because of our extended background, I was aware of some of the issues, but boy, my eyes were opened up because I'm not only dealing locally, I'm now having to deal with an organization that is representing women all over the United States, and we had an international connection, and that was a wake-up call. That I had to not only think locally, I also had to think globally about competition in that. Sal, I wanted to ask you, because I know that you went through a manufacturing background and a transition too. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So my background is in manufacturing and more specifically in electronics manufacturing. And I work for a lot of the big names, starting with Hewlett Packard. When again, Hewlett Packard thought that manufacturing was a competitive advantage, I actually got to see how they started to make the transition to saying, hey, manufacturing is a commodity. What we want to focus on is sales and marketing and design. And like everything, they started by outsourcing manufacturing within the United States to other people. They were called electronic manufacturing services. And again, treated it like a commodity. And then, of course, then from there, it went on to China. But I also worked for Motorola, same thing, when they thought that manufacturing and manufacturing a quality product, was a competitive advantage. People associate General Electric a lot with Six Sigma and all these quality processes, and that's true. But Motorola was actually came in even before them with all these quality initiatives. And And again, just to name a couple of other ones, Lutron Electronics that made lighting controls, ABB, which is a European company, a little bit more electrical than electronics. But I got to see all of this, and unfortunately, I also got to see how a lot of this was transferred to China because of the labor cost, quite honestly. And a little bit is also sort of a chicken and egg problem and an ecosystem problem, meaning, you're sitting down at the design table and you say, okay, this is the new product I'm going to design. Should I design it for automation to do it with, high-speed equipment, robots, whatever in the United States? Or should I design it for low labor? And then, of course, that meant Mexico and China. And a lot of times when you did even the financial analysis, it came out that you should design for low labor, and again in Mexico or China, which also, by the way, meant that it was very difficult to ever bring that product back to the US if you wanted to, because that design wasn't the right design to automate and bring back to the US. And it was like everything, the pool and the water was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and eventually there's no water left for the fish to breathe, and then at that point you have to do something else, or go to China, Philippines, whatever, or do something else. I chose to go out on my own and help people, as a business broker, and use my engineering and my business background to help small business owners in the US. But it pains me a lot to see that our manufacturing base is eroding.
Well, in Sal, at that time, they were probably still looking for you to make a 40% return on net assets too. Where the folks in Japan and China, if they get a 15% return on net assets, everybody's thrilled. And we're sitting over here at more than double that because of, primarily capital formation and capital markets, but also, if you went into a banker and said, hey, I expect to end up returning, I'll be real happy with a 5%, return on gross, they'll probably turn you down for the loan.
Yeah. Oh, no, and let me tell you, by the way, just to maybe piggyback on that for a second, because these are all personal experience, a little bit dated, but I think they're still true. Here in the US, if you're part of a big company, right, and you're just you have an engineering project that you want to fund and it's just internal. If you go to your CFO and you don't show them that your engineering project has, let's say, a 2-year payback, you don't even get off the starting block. If you go to Europe, and by the way, a lot of people don't realize this, but the Germans that don't have exactly a low labor rate are great manufacturers and great exporters. But you go to a place like Germany, they're willing to tolerate a 5-7 year payback. And that's why, internal to within the corporation. So that's why, again, they can be a great exporter, have a lot of automation, a lot of quality products, is because quite honestly, they have a little bit of a longer vision in terms of getting results out of these engineering projects that they're going to fund internally.
For the last 20 years, we've been talking about, this myopic concentration on the next quarter's worth of results instead of looking at a longer term.
Yeah, basically what we're doing, and I'm very blunt with bankers and everybody else, and I've raised a lot of capital. I say your greed gets in your way of long-term success. I'm not very popular at loan review boards at times, and I sit on them, so they're just going, oh God, why do we put this woman on here? But so what we're doing, and I saw some, hopefully some trends that there are some few CEOs saying, wait a minute, we need to back up and do a different style of thinking. If the bottom line is that exorbitant, and I say exorbitant because it gets in road of your long-term success, then we need to rethink this, because you're going to go up and down on cycles like yo-yos, and you make money, but it's gone. So we have to think of, and that's one of the strengths of small business. That's one of the reasons I love working with it, because I have worked with major corporations and would get fired every 6 months. And then for some reason they would hire me back, and I'd still do the same, So, hey, you're hiring me, you know what you're getting, folks. But the strength of small business is that whether it's a person of one or someone like you, Dolph, or we're willing to work for that long-term success. And one of the strengths of, like, on my family, my dad was second generation. His dad was the first. His dad was the first one born here. Now on my mother's side, I'm the ninth generation. So but you saw the willingness to work and work unbelievable hours, and sacrifice. And somehow there has to be a balance in between expected returns and looking at the long-term success of a company, and looking at a family-owned company. And I've worked with several of them. When they turn to um, that model of we've got to have this kind of return, they don't last. Whereas if they take a look at their people and the strength of the company and don't adopt outrageous returns, they last a long time. We lasted over 100 years until the nephew died, and it's just very unexpectedly. 100 years is pretty good long.
We talked yesterday about, you go into so many downtowns. And when I was a kid, they started out with, the cobbler's shop was down at the street level, and the family ended up living in the apartment above it. My dad's side of the family's business was a flower shop, and he had the good fortune to end up being he had the good fortune of having some capital, so he ended up building a 3 apartment complex right next to the flower shop. And of course, he ended up with the big apartment, which eventually went to my uncle. And my grandfather, my grandparents, and my dad lived there. And then there was a ground level apartment that was very small that was designed for their declining years, and that's where they stayed.
Yeah.
I remember the neon sign next door, and he was very, very proud of having immigrated from Italy and made it on his terms in the United States, which was amazing.
Well, I gotta ask, what part of Italy?
Naples.
Okay.
The Paladino clan came from Naples. So.
Yeah. Okay. We could go on forever.
Well, it's funny, JoAnn, because one of the things that I ended up doing, and I've always growing businesses, especially when you've got somewhat limited capital, has always been interesting to me. And one of the things that I ended up doing, because I'm very much a hands-on manager with my technology company, was I literally lived right next door to the office. And I probably stayed in that office building because of its proximity to home longer than I should have. I mean, to the point that I had way too many people in too few square feet.
Yeah.
Well, Dolph, let me ask you a question there. Because as maybe both of you know, my parents came from Cuba. So when they came from Cuba, they had literally the shirt on their back. That's hard for people here in the US to kind of wrap their head around, especially now, because now we have credit cards. Again, we have the internet, we have all these technologies, we have cell phones. Back in the early 60s, when you left with your shirt on your back, it was literally that. I mean, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have bank accounts, wire transfers, PayPal. I mean, nothing. It's literally if your family or somebody didn't come to the airport to pick you up, you were out on the streets. So they made that same level of sacrifice to kind of get ahead in this country. My question is, for somebody that has an entrepreneurial bent, that is saying, okay, listen, I'm willing to make whatever sacrifice is necessary for me to start my small company, whatever it is, and go forward. How critical is it to align support from friends and family? If you're already married, you have a spouse, or you may even have kids that have certain financial requirements, or older parents, whatever the case may be, or a girlfriend. How important is it to get that alignment in that sort of lifestyle vision, and then what do you do if you don't, if you can't get it?
Probably get divorced. My
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I mean that's highly prevalent. I mean, my wife has been with me through thick and thin, through multiple startups, ones that didn't work, ones that did work. Okay, she was, and I think because I had that, I ended up having that support. It was great. But in the beginning, I certainly didn't have, my dad had a very different idea of what I should be doing. He was expecting, he's an educator. He didn't like the ups and downs. He wanted kind of a sure thing. And, education ends up fitting. But, he thought I should go to work for the 60-year-old brick and mortar company and 4 decades later collect my gold watch, which doesn't happen anymore. And, that company's long gone. I mean, heck, the company that my mother's father worked for, Bell Laboratories, it's long gone as well. And no one would have ever expected that. It was one of the premier research institutes in the United States. So things are changing. You need to be ready to shuck and jive. But, unless, you know, unless you've got a solid, one year I went from $120,000 with income, and this was back in the 90s, from $120,000 a year salary to $12,000 my first year in business for myself. And my wife ended up making it work. And because of that, I have a huge debt of gratitude. But, that means we also both enjoy the upside.
Yeah, I'm going to add something because I've gone, I see what happens to a lot of women. And also in one of my lives, I was a counselor for years. And often my skills as counseling was called in business, but I also had a very analytical mind, and I got very interested in obtaining money. So interesting juxtaposition of services. I have to be very upfront with the people and say, if you need to, right up front, sit down with the potential spouse or the family member, because I had a lot of opposition, tremendous amount of opposition for me going into business from my own family. And eventually, 12 years later, when I was featured on a program with a well-known psychologist, all of a sudden, oh, we're proud of her. It was really amazing. But it still happens if you don't have that clear agreement. You need to think about what you're going to do and how you're going to run it. And often, in some of the cases where maybe the mother and father are in an agreement, the kids are disappointed because they no longer have the lifestyle that they were expecting. And so I've been called into a lot of cases where we've had to deal with all the unexpected attitudes and how that impacts the business. So that was a good question, Sal. The emotional side.
Let me just maybe again piggyback on what you said, JoAnn, and throw out something that people don't think about initially, which they should. When you have these discussions, because I've seen this as a pitfall.
Yeah.
Have extremely, and by the way, I recommend that you capture this discussion in some way, whether it's a piece of paper, not necessarily a formal contract that you sign, but at least a piece of paper. So 3 years down the road, there's no miscommunication or different recollections of what was talked about or whatever. But the big pitfall that I see is also establish very clearly and very specifically what the criteria are to terminate the business if you're not getting the results that are expected. Because a lot of times what I see is there's a spouse that has a normal corporate job, so he's bringing in the money, and the other spouse says, okay, great, so I'm going to start this business, and here's the forecast, and here's the hockey stick, and 5 years down the road, we're all going to be filthy rich and whatever. But instead, it becomes either very low profitable, maybe break even, sometimes even loses a little bit of money that even gets subsidized by the working spouse. But then there's no clear-cut criteria to pull the plug. And then so that just goes on forever and ever and ever. It even causes problems in the relationship at an interpersonal level. So anyway, long story short, have a part of the conversation needs to say, this is what's expected out of this business, and if we get to this level, then we just pull the plug, period, end of story.
You know, I think that's so true, because so many people end up, they flog it for years. They're not making money personally. The business really isn't going anywhere. And that old adage, if you're not growing, you're dying, is likely true. And I watch so many things in so many, not only manufacturing companies, but organizations as a whole. If you're not growing, you're dying. And, at what point in time do you have that criteria?
Mhm. Or what will you settle for as stability in your company that takes care of everything?
Right. And sometimes a lot of entrepreneurs have either too much ego or too much pride to end up hooking things together with other, because I've seen some companies. There's one group that I can think of right now where you had three companies that were functionally the land of the living dead, but there were synergies if all three of them ended up coming together. And they were fortunately about the same size. They ended up hooking up together. All of a sudden, they were all reporting to a single balance sheet, and they were actually able to do quite well. It's kind of funny when I think about the most successful people that I know. One man makes the most boring and mundane product you could ever think of, fasteners. Okay. But he makes them better than anyone else. And he has found a way to end up, completely appealing to his supply chain.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting.
We've been talking, oh golly, we've at least 35 minutes. And I always like to end up the show a couple different ways. One is, first of all, Dolph, give yourself a commercial. What are you doing now? And how to contact you. And then what's your business tip besides all the wisdom you've been sharing right now?
What am I doing now? I am chasing my grandkids. I enjoy that very much. I am president of GMC Motorhomes International, which is an association of aficionados of a 45-year-old motorhome. And we have rallies throughout the country, and we're planning for one here in Mansfield, Ohio shortly. We'll have about 150, 45-year-old motorhomes in one locations. And it's wonderful. It's a lot of fun. I still do some projects. I get called into manufacturing companies to tell them what they already know. Isn't that what consulting is, Sal?
Absolutely.
On more than one occasion. Sometimes I end up finding out things that they didn't know. But it all comes down to, and here comes the tip, JoAnn. It doesn't matter what industry you're in or what you do. You're in the people business.
Yep.
And Sal, I think we forget that.
How do you want people to contact you? Seriously.
I'm either online. I'm very easy to find. And you can use Dolph at dolphsantorine.com, or I'm at 304-219-3100. And of course, that connects to my pocket. Monoceros Ventures is our kind of our adventure capital arm.
Sal, your turn.
Well, I'm actually going to give two tips very quickly. One is for anybody that's listening, if any of the topics that we have resonated, please feel free to call us and be proactive. Even if it's an issue that I say, okay, yeah, that's fine, but I don't need to deal with that for 1, 2, 3 years down the road. I would encourage people to start the conversation now, because you may need to approach things in a slightly different way, or God forbid, if it's a problem, is not going to get better by waiting. 99% of problems don't get better by waiting. So tip number one is be proactive. Don't be shy about contacting any of us. And two, by the way, since I'm a business broker and I help people buy and sell businesses and sometimes get involved with startups or whatever the case may be, going back to what Dolph said, a lot of people want these these businesses that are very high tech, apps for the cell phone and software and artificial intelligence and all this stuff. But there's a lot of very nichey, very mundane businesses that you wouldn't even think about, that are extremely profitable, extremely good to get in, sometimes have a wide moat that protects them in whatever way, shape, or form. So tip number 2 is don't get focused on sort of the glamour businesses or the sexy businesses. Look at some of these other opportunities too, because you may discover that they're really great. And again, somebody like a business broker may help you bring some of these opportunities to the surface and explore them and find out that they're a little hidden gem. In terms of contacting me, same thing. I've got my cell phone with me all the time, 484-358-9470. Again, 484-358-9470. And for some of the people that should not be, but are shy about calling, you want to email me, Sal, SAL459 @yahoo.com. Again, Sal, SAL459 @yahoo.com. And both of those go straight to me.
Well, this is the Empress of Biz, and yes, I'm going to give myself a plug. We work with small businesses to clarify where they are going. We also do something a little different. We work with your pricing structure in such a manner that we can tell you down to the single cup of coffee how many you have to sell a day to break even. And it's done in a simple way, because we found that most people do not understand, you have to make in big long terms that accountants use. And I love my accountant, but he's got to shorten his words. So we work with people to try to make the concept a lot easier. Also, I do a lot of writing and profiling for people, and I love doing the podcasting and broadcasting, because the stories here and the knowledge of small business people is fascinating. And what they've gone through, the challenges, their motivation. I love doing it. So if you'd like to be involved with us, please give me a call at 412-440-6969. That's the office landline, 412-440-6969. The cell is 412-670-4322. We have a Facebook page, Empress of Biz, Listen, Learn, Prosper. Also, my business tip is don't let anybody push you into doing what they want you to do. You have to live this business, and you have to make it go. And when you're doing something that doesn't feel right, having made some really disastrous mistakes, and by the grace of God surviving them, something's wrong. When you got that knot in your stomach, and everything looks right, but if something's telling you something's wrong, it's wrong. So, gentlemen, thank you for your time. I look forward to a further conversation, Dolph, and I'm so glad you're having a great time now.
And JoAnn, thank you very much for inviting me. And Sal, thank you for inviting me on your podcast.
Thank you, Dolph, for being our guest. And thank you, JoAnn, for being my co-host. And we'll definitely have to continue the conversation at another time.
Yes.